anyone accepting the broad facts of my account on the arguments I have adduced will not go wrong. He will put less faith in the glorified tales of the poets and the compilations of the prose chroniclers, whose stories are written more to please the ear than to serve the truth, are incapable of proofs, and for the most part, given the lapse of time, have passed into the unreliable realms of romance. He will conclude that my research, using the clearest evidence available, provides a sufficiently accurate account considering the antiquity of the events. That's from Thucydides, his book, The Peloponnesian War. Welcome to Hot Takes on the Classics. My name is Tim McIntosh.
And I'm Emily Maeda.
And you have joined us for Thucydides, The Peloponnesian War. And you've joined us in a season about war. And Emily, you're going to lead us on this discussion of Thucydides. I'm really excited about this episode because it touches on probably like one of the most famous wars, not just in ancient history, but in world history, the war between Athens and Sparta.
Yeah. And maybe some of our listeners have heard parts of the Peloponnesian War. We actually, in our next episode, are going to be discussing one speech from his entire account. But to read the entire narrative is really fascinating. It's really fascinating. And the thing that I find most fascinating about it is that Thucydides has, when the war breaks out, a sense that this is going to be big. And he sets about right from that moment making notes about what's happening and deciding that he is going to tell, he's going to tell it. He's going to give us exactly what happens. So that opening account, the opening quote that we heard from you is from the beginning, where he's laying out how Athens and Sparta come to war. And he is talking about past events, but in that quote, he sets out how he's going to handle these events. So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
What do you know about the Peloponnesian War, Tim?
Athens versus Sparta. I know that in my telling of it, like the good guys lost, because like,
wow,
man,
that's harsh.
Well, it's Sparta. It's like Sparta wins. It's a long war interrupted by, there's kind of a halftime in the middle of this war. And I'm a fan of ancient Athens. I think anyone who is a fan of the classics looks at a few cities in Western civilization and they're like, these are zenith moments. These are zenith civilizations. And number one on almost everybody's list is either Athens, Jerusalem, or Rome. It's one of those three. And you know what? Sorry, none of them say Sparta. Though there are amazing things about Sparta that we'll, I'm sure, highlight either in this episode or the next one. But that's why I say Athens, like the good guy, Athens lost to Sparta. The good guys lost.
Well, it is that funny thing of, I guess this is maybe calling that into question, that the victors write the history. Because, they're the conquered, but why nobody likes the Spartans. The Spartans kind of suck.
Totally. It's funny that phrase, like the winners write history, it has this kind of a little bit of a superficial appeal to it.
It does.
Like,
it does.
Like the good guy, like the winners destroy the history books and rewrote them. And there are times that is absolutely true, but it's also pretty superficial because this is a classic example of.
This is the best example.
Right. So
this is the best example.
Yeah.
But it is funny because we really don't like the Spartans. And I have to say, in Thucydides' account, that's one of the things, what is Thucydides' reputation now? If you were to mention the name Thucydides, what would be the associations that come to mind?
For me, he is the inheritor of the tradition started by the kind of the first historian, sometimes called the first modern historian, and it's Herodotus. So Herodotus wrote a history, big whopper of a like door stop book.
Yeah.
And he is the first one who would make claims like this. The Persian army defeated the Athenian army not because the gods were on the sides of the Persians, but because the Persians had a larger army and it was better equipped. So like we just take that for granted. That's what history does. History like it tries to give like a cause and effect, citing causes, showing effects based on real data, eyewitness accounts, et cetera, et cetera. But this is not really what history was before Herodotus and a little bit later Thucydides.
Well, and we're going to investigate whether the assumptions about Thucydides. So Thucydides is a darling throughout history.
Yeah.
The Romans love him. The medievals love him. The Enlightenment loves him. And especially he is a darling of the 19th century scientific historical approach or historical positivism. But I'm not sure that that's fair. So we're going to talk about that.
Do I hear a hot take coming a little bit later in the show?
Maybe. But nonetheless, he does, this, and one of the most important things is this is written in prose, which Herodotus does too. But prose is not a thing in the ancient world, right? Poetry is a thing in the ancient world.
Right.
Poetry is what conveys elevated thoughts. People think poetically. People don't think in propositional statements. But I think that's part of the reason that we like Thucydides is because that's how he reports things. So let's start.
I want to hear who Thucydides was, Emily.
Exactly.
Tell us about who he was.
So he is born around 460 BC. The war between Athens and Sparta begins in 431. So he is a young man when the war starts. And it is kind of remarkable that he decides he's going to chronicle it right from the beginning. That's what he tells us. He is from a leading family in Athens, a family that is sort of a rival to Pericles' family, the leader of Athens at this time. But Thucydides loves Pericles. He loves him. He thinks he's amazing. And we will definitely get that in the speeches that he records from Pericles. So he eventually assumes command of a fleet during the war, and he loses a very important battle. And he is then tried and exiled by the Athenians. But this is another reason that people really love him, because in his account, he says, it was actually kind of good because I got to hear the other side and it made my history better. So he takes it completely stoically that he is exiled by his homeland, and he gathers more from the Spartan side. So he thinks it benefits his history. So the Peloponnesian War ends in 404 BC, and he actually comes back to Athens because Athens has been defeated. So the people who exiled him are no longer in command. But he dies soon after. So his chronicle only goes through 411 BC. So he doesn't get the ending of the war. But one of the remarkable things about his account is that there is really no other account that comes to the foreground. So 3 historians take up the events right after the Peloponnesian Wars. But no one goes back and sort of says, yeah, Thucydides was wrong about this and he didn't get this right. Like, it stands as the definitive account. Now, historians know that he has some errors, but it is remarkably well-balanced. Is that the right word?
Yeah.
It's remarkably well-balanced. And not only his recording of the events, but his commentary throughout the account, it's still cited all through Western history. And even currently, have you heard of the Thucydides trap?
No, I haven't heard of the Thucydides trap. That's a hard word to say quickly.
Well, saying Thucydides is actually really difficult, and I'm probably going to mess it up the whole time we're talking about it.
It's probably like a test of whether or not you really have academic chops or not. It's like
Totally.
whether you can spell Nietzsche and whether you can pronounce Thucydides quickly.
Exactly. Okay, Thucydides. I can't even do it. Okay, so here's the Thucydides trap. It comes from this quote, which he writes, "In my view, the real reason, true but unacknowledged, which forced the war was the growth of Athenian power and Spartan fear of it." So the Thucydides trap is, somebody has written an academic paper about this, and there's a lot of questions about it, whether it's accurate or not, but it is the rise of a rival power is inevitable for war. So it's recently been applied to America's relations with, can you guess?
Got to be China.
China.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to pause on this. Can you say it again? The rise of an enemy's power.
No, of a rival power. So
of a rival power.
Of a rival power. Yeah.
That's kind of the cause for a war.
Because their power is growing and the power on top fears it.
So
there's sort of
right.
So they've gone through and they've listed out 16 different areas where this happens. So one war that I thought repeatedly about while I was reading Thucydides was World War I, because in that Germany is a rising power, right? And they are threatening England's primacy within the world, and that's sort of seems to be an inevitability that will bring war. So
right.
The other place that Thucydides is often referenced is in regards to the Cold War, which is really interesting. Because you have a bipolar world, meaning you've got two rival powers, and you can think about that in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, that all secondary alliances and countries were viewed through the lens of how it would help the other rival power, right? So we become involved in Vietnam because we say it can't fall to the Soviet Union. We've got to squash out communism. So Thucydides, he lives on and on. He lives on
because
and on.
Because he makes this observation, and it seems to be like a really keen insight into the way that global national conflict seems to happen. I want to kind of camp on this for a second, Emily, because it makes so much sense. I remember since the fall of the Soviet Union, then there was trouble directed toward the United States from Afghanistan and from Iraq and Iran. And it seems like, and now we're worried about China, and it seems like there's almost like a vacuum gets created as soon as a massive power or a massive threat falls. So into the Cold War, Soviet Union collapses. We celebrate in 1989 because the Berlin Wall fell. And then next day, we start looking around for who the next great threat is. There's like, you know what I mean? Like it's almost like an anxiety vacuum or something like that. Okay, who's going to come get us next?
Completely. Well, and a lot of it was discussed in the Cold War more in terms of the alliances that were formed with, like, for instance, the U.S. The U.S. was willing to form alliances with pretty shady characters just because they weren't communist, right?
Yeah.
So something equally happens in this war between Athens and Sparta. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, and it's so hard for us to think this way because we think in nation states, but these are city-states.
Right.
These are not nation states, right? That concept does not exist. Like, that's a modern concept. But it's hard for us to think about that. Don't you think of them as like...
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
they're bigger than just a city. Yeah, exactly. I think of them as... And you know what? Isn't part of the reason that we think that way, of course, is because we're used to thinking in terms of nations, because that's what we've known for the last 200 years.
Exactly.
But one of the other reasons I think that I tend to think of Athens and Sparta as nations, not just city-states, is because they're such distinct ways of life.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And you know how that happens because communication, travel, all of that is so much more limited, right?
Yeah.
So you're not getting to Sparta really quickly. So therefore, these smaller regions have a chance to grow and be distinct, right? Rather than the commerce that we have now that makes it so much larger.
Right.
So, okay. So here are the events of the war. And Thucydides spends a long time on that, like why it comes to be. But he sums it up. Basically, it was inevitable because Athens was rising in power and Sparta was afraid of it. So Athens and Sparta have various treaties and alliances with other city-states in the Greek, I want to say the Greek Peloponnese, but the Peloponnese is a subset of Greece. So we should talk about geography a little bit because it is actually really confusing. So the Peloponnese, do you know what the Peloponnese looks like?
They're like,
can you remember?
Fingers, right?
Yeah, right. And it's only connected by the thinnest isthmus between like Corinth, right? So it's connected to the Greek mainland, but just by the smallest thread. And then Athens is part of the Greek mainland. It's in the region called Attica. So these terms are used. So when they say the Peloponnese, that's the area that Sparta controls through their alliances, and Athens controls Attica through their alliances. So this is another reason that it felt so reminiscent of World War I, because they don't even come into direct conflict at the beginning. They come into conflict through two subsidiary city-states that get in an argument. Corcyra and Corinth. And Corcyra is allied with Athens and Corinth is with Sparta. So then those two call in the other sides and say, are you going to help us, right? The big power, are you going to help us? So that's how we start.
And, excuse me, that reminds you of World War I, because World War I was all of these alliances.
Exactly.
And these alliances, excuse me.
Sorry.
Once Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, it's a matchstick that lights up all of the other alliances. And so instead of just being a skirmish between two nation states, everybody gets involved immediately. It's like a matchstick house that just becomes engulfed because of just this one tiny spark.
Exactly. And so, I mean, it's not quite the same because we're talking about smaller areas, but in the sense that it's an alliance that sort of trips it off, it does. And when they're discussing why they're going to go to war, they're like, if we let the other one gain an upper hand here, it's going to be bad for us, right? So they both have that sense. So here's another outline of the war that makes it really interesting. Sparta is a land army. It's got a massive land army. Everybody's afraid of them. But Athens is queen of the seas.
Right.
She has a fantastic navy. So when it begins, we have Archidamus, who's the head of Sparta, and we've got Pericles, and both of them know, like, we're not going to be able to take the other one over. They know from the outset it's going to have to be a war of attrition in order to finish them off. They know that the other's strength can't be combated by their strength, which is very fascinating. Right. They see it right at the outset. And you have a sense from Thucydides that if Archidamus and Pericles had been the leaders for the entire time, but of course they can't be because they die part of the way through, that it maybe wouldn't have lasted so long, or the outcome may have been different. But alas and alack, they don't. So they begin to fight. And there's a great quote. He says, "At that time, there were many young men, both in the Peloponnese and in Athens, who had no experience of war and welcomed their chance of involvement. Isn't that a great quote?
What a great line.
But
yeah, it's like the old men who have actually seen war are over there being like,
don't do it.
You want to get involved? You think you want to get involved? You don't want to get involved.
You don't do it. I mean, this is about war's time out of mind, which is actually one of my takeaways. I'm just going to say it now. War is fought by young men, eager young men.
Yeah.
It's even in the Iliad, isn't it? Where Nestor comes and is like, this is going to be terrible, you guys. This is going to be terrible. This is in World War I. Hey, this is going to be terrible. We don't want to go to war. But anyway, there we go. So
I'm thinking also of what's the line from the 7 Ages of Man talking about the young man full of strange oaths, right? And it seems like this. So Shakespeare talks about these 7 different stages, especially of a man's life, and he gets to stage 4, a soldier full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. It's all this military language. A soldier, the cannon's mouth. And it's like, that was me as a young man.
Aren't you too tired to go fight a war right now?
Yes, my body hurts. I'm going to sleep until 8 a.m. and I can't even do that.
Exactly. I have a 15-year-old boy though, and I could see you just see like, give me a challenge and I'm going to take it, right?
Absolutely.
That's what they want.
Absolutely.
That's what they want.
And it needs to just be guided toward positive
good
ends,
things.
Not toward war.
Exactly. Run a great race. Run a great 5K.
Totally.
Run a great 5K.
That's right.
Take it there. Okay, so the war begins, and it begins over this kerfuffle between Corcyra and Corinth. But these two leaders are really kind of brilliant, and you get so Sparta is sort of known for its cautiousness, its deliberativeness, it's the power. It doesn't need to do anything else. Athens is known for being, they're the upstart. They're the reason we love Athens. They're innovative. They're creative. They've got all these philosophers. They've got playwrights, right?
Right.
Sparta thinks Athens is a little foofy, and Athens thinks Sparta is kind of stodgy. You agree?
Yeah, I want to add something more to stodgy. I think that they think...
you don't like that term?
Athens
I don't understand.
Sparta's... No, I think stodgy, but I think of stodgy as an old man, kind of grumpy old man,
come
get
on.
off my
That's
lawn.
A little bit how they are.
But I don't know. I think of them as like sort of CrossFit lads.
No, okay. That is the Spartan. What's the word? I don't know. What's
Reputation.
The word? Reputation.
Icon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But Archidamus is not discussed that way at all. He's like, they're telling him, why aren't you being more? Which actually is kind of surprising to me. You're saying that about Sparta because of their reputation for like training their kids in military arts, right? Yeah.
Right.
That's an interesting thing that came out to me, is that Archidamus is really slow. So anyway, he goes out and tries to take Pericles on, and Pericles just does not engage him in land battles because Pericles is smart and knows Athens can't do it.
Right.
Do you know who he reminded me of?
Did he remind you of Scipio?
Oh. No, he didn't, but that's a good one too.
Okay.
Who did he
remind you of?
Somebody else. Somebody in like 1800 on.
Oh. Not Robert E. Lee.
No.
Okay.
Let's go through all the great generals. You know this guy. You like him too. Kutuzov, the Russian general.
Oh.
In the Napoleonic Wars.
From War and Peace. Oh my gosh. Yeah, one of my great heroes. He's so great. So why did he remind you of him? Because
he just won't engage him. And Archidamus is like, well, why won't he come out and fight me? And Pericles is like, we don't need to. Need to.
Yeah, and also because I'm smart.
Yeah.
I'm smart enough to not take you on head on.
Exactly. Because I know you're better than me. So why would I engage you? Right? But isn't that smart? Brilliant.
It's very smart.
Pericles is brilliant, which
we will talk about this in the next. in the next episode. Do not miss the next episode because Pericles is going to like really shine.
Plays a prominent part. Okay, so it seems like, and Athens is winning sea battles because, of course, they're dominant there, and the Spartans really don't know what to do on the sea. He describes that a lot. But then something dreadful happens to Athens. Do you know what it is, Tim?
Oh, gosh, no. Tell me. I probably do know it. I don't.
You do.
Can't remember.
It's the plague.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, the plague comes through Athens. So once again, so this is interesting because Thucydides does not attribute action to the gods, but he also doesn't leave the gods out. He references oracles going to Delphi. He references strange natural phenomenons that come at the same time. He references oracles. So there is an oracle about the plague that comes up. But his description of the plague, oh my gosh, it's so terrible. It is.
You've got it in our show notes.
Terrible.
Should I read it?
Do.
So this is from, of course, Peloponnesian War, section 250. Indeed, the pathology of the disease defied explanation. Not only did it visit individuals with a violence beyond human endurance, but there was also this particular feature which put it in a different category from all other diseases with which we are familiar. Although many bodies lay unburied, the birds and animals which prey on human flesh kept away from them, or if they did eat, died of it. The most dreadful aspects of the whole affliction were the despair into which the people fell when they realized they had contracted the disease.
Isn't that awful? It's so awful reading the account.
That's, yeah. Oh, well, my goodness.
And this connects to Pericles because the discussion we're going to have on our next episode is in relationship to soldiers who have died from plague.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the plague, it kind of can't be overstated what a tragedy this is for Athens because they get it and Sparta doesn't.
Yeah.
And they are incredibly weakened by it. Pericles dies a little time after. He survives the first years of the plague and then he succumbs. And in Thucydides' account, it really is clear that the death of Pericles is going to kind of spell the defeat of Athens because he has a sense that Athens has done well because Pericles has been at the helm. Pericles' right thinking and right action has guided them on a good course. So the last speech he gives to Pericles is a speech after the plague has passed and the Athenians are mad and upset and they want to throw Pericles out.
Yeah.
And he as a great leader. So I think that's another great thing that Thucydides gives to us is this account of what makes a leader great. Pericles senses why the masses are turning on him, and he names it, and he says, look, we've got to stay the course. We've just got to stay the course. And Thucydides writes this. Pericles' power was in his distinguished reputation and his intellect, and he was patently incorruptible. He controlled the mass of people with a free hand, leading them rather than letting them lead him. What was happening was democracy in name, but in fact, the domination of the leading man.
That is such a fascinating quote. It's such a fascinating quote.
It sure is.
Maybe not in this season, we'll talk about the great philosophers of Athens are, of course, living in a democracy. Athens is credited as being the birthplace of democracy.
Yes.
And Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are all pretty suspicious of democracy. And it sounds in this quote like, yeah, Thucydides might be too. You know, what is it like? Oh, there's another line. Sorry, it's another Shakespeare line from Coriolanus. The many-headed hydra that is the people, the many-headed hydra, you know? Like, and what a great example. Pericles is one of the statesmen of all time.
He really is.
The absolute great statesman of all time. And even he had to like deal with just the whims of the masses turning against him. You know, like every leader has to face this.
Yes.
And it's almost like it's not if it's going to happen. The question is, what's your response going to be?
Right, exactly. Some later philosophers and political theorists have been like, yeah, see, Thucydides, he's against democracy. I don't think you can really say that. I think he just finds, it seems like he's just naming the paradox within it, that it doesn't matter, right? If you say, oh, it's government by the people, it still matters who the leader is, because the leader is going to get, right?
No doubt.
So, okay, so Athens is now horribly weakened, not only because of plague, but also because Pericles. So she's going to have other leaders. But he says when Pericles dies, like, well, long and short of it, they all suck because they're out for their own gain, right? So Alcibiades is kind of the leader that Thucydides really names as, hey, he's just out for his own self-aggrandizement. Right. His line in there is great about him. So it's going to take another, 20-ish years, but Athens is going to fall. But it is interesting that at that point, Thucydides sees sort of the writing on the wall. Now, of course, he's writing it afterwards, but he does see that the decisions made by Athens will be fatal.
Mm-hmm.
So there we go. They fight, and Athens loses. How's that for the rest of the book?
Yeah, that's the Spark Notes. I love
it. There
you
go.
But I want to, I think it sounds like it's hot take time.
Oh, we've got a few more. I've got some things.
Okay.
I've got a few more things to say, but it's going to be a hot take in just a second. So
I love it.
Takeaways. War is fought by young men. I've already said that. And he nothing has changed. He is a very careful chronicler, and he is very faithful in his retelling of events. But to me, the best part of the account are his speeches, which are the speeches that he wrote. I mean, he didn't have a readout. He was present for maybe some of them. He's probably present for Pericles' funeral oration. But he doesn't have a transcription of the speeches.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't have an audio recorder.
No, he does not. So my favorite set of speeches was between Cleon and Diodotus, and they're Athenians. And Cleon is advocating that some of the Athenian allies be treated incredibly harshly. And Diodotus is saying, we need to have restraint here because we're an empire. And if our vassal states see how we treat this one, they're going to rise up. We need to do it with restraint and with due diligence. The stuff that he has them say, you read Cleon's speech and you're like, yeah, that's great. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you read Diodotus and you're like, oh no, he's
that's
right. And Diodotus, he just has these great lines. Like, for instance, in peace and prosperous times, both states and individuals observe a higher morality. It's true. War, he says basically after that, war just makes you do crazy things.
Yeah.
And how about this? In my opinion, the two greatest impediments to good decision-making are haste and anger. I just was writing all these down like, he's so right.
What great lines. It's so
He's
true.
So right. He's so pithy and so right. And he is still looked to as a thinker on strategy, on the nature of war, the nature of politics, political theory. And another really interesting thing, he never demonizes his enemies, which I think is part of the reason that we trust his account, right?
Right.
The Spartans are never made to be horrible, bloodthirsty people. And he points out the problems of the Athenians just as much as he points out the problems of the Spartans. So,
Emily, I want to not leave the quote about the two things that make bad decisions are haste and anger.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, I was looking in my email drafts list, and I have 54 drafts of unsent emails. Okay. And I was like, dude, 54? And so I was like, what are these? And so I just started looking through them, and some were just like, a sentence fragment that I just never really completed.
Yeah.
But you know what a lot of them are? There were emails that, do you have the same thing?
I have them too.
I think this is like evidence that we're maybe like, I don't know, like we've learned something.
Yeah.
Because for me, those emails, a lot of them are, I was really mad about something and I blitzed off an email. I'm going to correct some wrong that was done to me or done to somebody else. And I had at least the wisdom to say, don't send it until tomorrow.
Yeah. We have learned a few things.
And then when I waited, right? I waited, and then like, I was like, oh, I'm not that upset about that issue anymore.
Yeah,
or I read it. I read it and I was like, yeah, that's just not going to do anybody any good.
That's going to make it worse.
Right. It's going to make it worse. I'm just going to like throw a match on the fire, or throw a match on the tinder.
Totally. That's why. Okay. So, I mean, this is why it's a great text, because when you come to it, you say, he is so right. And this could be written like this discourse between Cleon and Diodotus. It sounds very recent to political arguments that I am hearing today.
Oh, really? Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, ready for the hot take?
I'm so ready for the hot take.
Okay. Here it is. Thucydides is not a modern historian or a political realist. He is.
Oh. Okay.
Okay.
I'm so curious about this. I want to hear, though.
Yeah.
Tell me what a political realist is, because I have a notion in my mind of what you mean. But what do you mean?
Well, that's kind of back to the beginning when we were talking about his sense that international relations, that some of these things are inevitable. So therefore, you need to form alliances, and you're not dealing as you would within your own city-state. The rules of morality don't apply so much. So people in the realpolitik.
Right.
So Henry Kissinger loved Thucydides.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense.
Doesn't it?
Makes a lot of sense.
The question remains, is that Thucydides' position, or is that just how he's reporting
his
things
reputation
went down?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm going to say that we're coming out of a time of historical positivism. Here's the idea. We can go back and scientifically prove events that happened, right? And there is one account, and what we need to get to is the truest account from the most impartial observer to finally say this is the definitive account of events, right? That's historical positivism.
Right, right.
Do you hold to that view of history?
I don't, but maybe I could try to articulate what my view is, and you can tell me if I'm a positivist or not. I do think that there are better and worse accounts. I might not think that there's like one single account, because I think to actually do that, you would have to amass, how do I say this?
Yeah.
All of the participants' voices that had anything to do with that. Right. And so it's just not, we don't have the kind of epistemic channel to absorb that breadth of voices. But I do still think that there's I think we lose a ton if we just say, yeah, we can't really say anything about history. It's just all competing voices. I don't think 100%. That either.
Yeah. I agree. 100%. So we don't have to, we can take sort of the middle ground, which is what I think Thucydides does, is that he does not say that he has no alliances or allegiances, because he is an Athenian believer. He loves Athens. It's his home.
Right, right.
But the reason I think that we trust his account is that for whatever he may have gotten wrong, it does appear that he is giving equal treatment to the other side, that he is searching for truth, right? That truth is sort of a guiding principle for Thucydides. But I don't think that he is what the modern historical positivists wanted to claim that he was. I don't think he was that, and I don't think he ever claimed to be.
Yeah.
So I have recently been rereading a favorite historian of mine, John Lukács. Do you know John Lukács?
Only through you, and I know how much you love him.
I love him.
And I love what you've told me about him, but I've never read him.
So this is a quote about him that I'm going to read for you. And I think that this gives a great summation of who Thucydides is. This says, for Lukács, human knowledge, such as the knowledge derived from peering through a telescope at a distant galaxy, is always personal and participatory. I love that. Human knowledge is always personal and participatory. Descartes was wrong. There is no mind-matter dichotomy and no such thing as objective, quote-unquote, reality. Reality is what we perceive, yes, but also when and how we perceive it, and is therefore inextricably a product of our perceptions, as well as the perceptions of our fellows living in societies, cultures, and geographies, existing in various points in space and time. History, because it is always a product of human perception in a given present moment, is both ephemeral and obscure. So Lukács is a historian, and he doesn't say that there isn't any way we can know it. But he basically gets to what you say, Tim, is that there are so many perspectives that really a full understanding of history, like pure truth, is the property of God alone, which is a paraphrase of Kierkegaard, one of your favorite guys.
Yeah. That, you know, Emily, the more we do these podcasts, I want to almost just like speak directly to the listeners and say, the word objective is a word that has become shorthand for
the most true, the most real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think probably when you and I hear that word, at least for me, I immediately start getting a little bit suspicious.
Me too. Yeah.
It's not to say that we don't want a doctor or a judge to have an objective point of view. Like, I get what's trying to be communicated when we say, man, I want this judge to be objective in their assessment of my case. Of course, that's what we want. But I think what we really want from the judge is fairness.
Exactly.
What we don't want, or we don't think a judge can have, is just like an aloof position that hovers above all of the events. Yeah, that's just that's not part of what's possible. Okay, so now I'm really going to go on for a second. This, I think, is and you got to hear me to the end here. This is one of the basic complaints of postmodernism against modernism and the Enlightenment.
Totally.
So the Enlightenment has this like objective ideal.
Object divide. Right. The Cartesian divide.
And postmodernism is like pointing out there's no such thing as that. Now,
right.
A lot of postmodernists go in a negative direction, just say like, yeah, we got no shot at actually knowing anything.
Yes.
But then a constructive postmodernist would say, no, we're just subjective to the notion of objectivity, but we still think that we can make claims that such and such is true, such and such false, this is good, this is bad. That would be a kind of constructionist postmodern view.
Which is the camp that Lukács falls into. He doesn't say that there's no truth or that certain histories can't be more true than the other. He just says the notion that we sit outside of events is false. And he has a brilliant essay called History and Physics, where he walks through how quantum physics has destroyed this sense. So put that out there to you. But there you go. That's my hot take.
That's Thucydides. That was a great hot take, Emily.
Thanks, Tim.
That was a hot take. Listen, we want to thank everyone for tuning into the show. We encourage you, if you enjoyed Thucydides, I think you're going to really like our next podcast, which is one section from Thucydides The Peloponnesian War. I know, I'm guilty. And it's a speech, Pericles' funeral oration. I think you're going to really enjoy it, and you might even find some of the things that you love about like our own world in this ancient speech by Pericles. We want to thank Clark Stefanik, who is our producer, True North, who is our platform. If you like this show, you might like Classical U podcast or any of the other shows on True North platform. Our music was written and performed by Tom Hagerman, and we are always appreciative, especially when we hear him in our ears. Emily, thanks for doing the show with me. I'm looking forward to talking about Pericles.
Thanks, Tim.